Oh my gosh, this is unpleasant. I don't know if any of that was visible on the camera, but I just went through the mother of all swarms. I don't know what kind of bugs those were, but they hurt. So I'm on Marsh Creek Road on my way to Morgan Territory, which is a national preserve sort of over those mountains over there. And I figured I would answer some questions that some people asked me on some of my previous videos about the Honda Trail, and also just about where I live. A lot of people think that where I live looks like the UK. Now, obviously it's not, given where I am on the road here. But also this is just what most of Northern California looks like. I live in the East Bay. So if you go that way for quite a bit, you'll be in San Francisco. So it is kind of strange that you can have scenery like this, and about 40 minutes away you have downtown San Francisco on the ocean with the bay there, and Oakland and Berkeley and all that. But that's just the East Bay. That's the way it looks. In the winter time, when it's the rainy season, and that's really, we only have two seasons, the rain season and the dry season, all of this would be green. And in fact, back that way a little bit, the hills they don't have very many trees on them, and they turn very green, and that's where the if you remember the old Windows XP background that was these rolling green hills, that's where that picture was taken, was sort of over there. Up in that way is wine country and Livermore, which is a sort of a wine town. That's what it was established as. It was established as a town for growing wine, selling wine, before Napa Valley was a thing. And the people in Livermore, they have a saying that Napa is for auto parts and Livermore is for wine, which is kind of snarky, but there's a lot more wine that's grown in Napa, but Livermore is everywhere you look. There's wine fields, or wine vineyards, I mean. Livermore is known more now for the lab that's there, which is where I work. It's a Department of Energy lab. They have the inertial confinement fusion research there, where they recently had net positive energy. I don't work on inertial confinement fusion. I work on planetary defense, which is essentially protecting the planet from asteroids and using whatever means we can to deflect them if we get early enough warning. And I do simulations of exactly how we would deflect them and what would be effective and things like that. And so I was involved in the DART mission in a very small way. I was involved in the early planning of what kind of science return there might be for the DART mission. Anyway, that was a bit of a diversion from what I was talking about. This is what Northern California looks like for those who aren't from here or have never been here. It's very pastoral when you get away from the city. There's a lot of farming, a lot of ranching, and then there's a lot of national preserved land and state preserved land. Another question that I've been asked on both on this channel and my main channel, which is where I talk about science and philosophy, is Why Do I Sound Like I'm High? And that's just what a Californian sounds like, I think. I can't answer it any better than that. I think if you are familiar with how Robert Downey Jr. sounds, or Chris Pine, or Jeff Bridges, you know, they all grew up in a very similar area to where I grew up. Chris Pine and I think, are the same age, so if I sound like I have the same accent as him, then maybe you think Chris Pine sounds like he's high all the time too. I don't know. Now, one thing that I am aware of that puts me at a disadvantage against other YouTubers, and I've been doing YouTube for probably 2 years now, maybe 3 years, mostly on my other channel, which I haven't updated in quite a while, actually. I should get back to that. Is that I don't quite have the charisma that it takes to explode as a YouTuber. And if you watch Spite's Corner, which you probably do if you're watching a motorcycle channel, you may have heard him mention that people he knows in real life tell him that he sounds strange on YouTube because he normally has a much more muted and lower energy voice than what he does on his YouTube channel. And he punches up his voice for his channel. He's like, hey, I'm gonna test out the Kawasaki KLM whatever today. That's kind of a necessary thing to get people's interest, to keep their interest. Birch from Lifer Birch does this too. He punches up his voice. He'll say something like, oh my god, that guy has no shirt on. And that really works for them. It keeps people engaged in the video, which makes sense. Like, who wants to watch a video where somebody with a very low energy voice like mine is just sort of passively taking in the environment? And that environment better be pretty freaking interesting for somebody to keep watching. Maybe this is. I don't know. I think it looks nice. But I just don't have the energy or the willpower to make my voice like that. I do want to talk about the Insta360 for a little bit, because whoa, I left the seat there. I have on my Honda Rebel the hot shoe quick release for the Insta360, which I don't recommend anybody buy. I do think the camera is great, and maybe someday I'll do a video about the camera and what's cool about it. But the hot release, or quick release thing, has a major design flaw in the way that the foot sits in the shoe. So if you think about how a quick release works, you know, the foot is permanently attached to the bottom of the camera. Oh, that was a big bee that just exploded. The foot's permanently attached to the bottom of the camera, and it sits into a shoe, and you push a button that releases the foot when you want to take the camera off, but you never take the foot off the camera. And there's a screw on the bottom of the foot that goes into the normal, I think it's 1/4 inch camera mount on the bottom of the 360. The way that the screw sits in the foot, when the foot is in the shoe, there's a little bit of a gap between the head of the screw and the bottom of the shoe, and so the screw can just back itself out, and when it does, the camera is not secured onto the foot anymore, and it just starts wobbling all over the place, and it can sort of screw itself off and fly off the bike. Now, thankfully that didn't happen to me, but I did notice it on the freeway. It was just going all over the place, and that was not a pleasant experience. So I put some thread lock on it to keep that from happening, but then once I took the foot off to mount the camera somewhere else, then I just needed to put more thread lock, and I just stopped using it. It's not worth it. So that's my review of the quick release for the Insta360. I don't think you should get it, but the camera's great. Now, I think the thing that got the most questions of any video I've ever posted on my moto channel is about the crate that I have on the back of my trail here. So I will probably put a link in the description for this video to what that crate is. I just got it from Amazon, and on the rack on the Honda Trail there are 4 screw holes that fit M6 bolts. So essentially you just get 4 M6 bolts, drill 4 holes in the crate that match the places of those bolts, and bolt it into the rack. It's not that complicated. And it's really nice having a collapsible crate because I can put it up anytime I need to take something with me, but then I can put it back down for most rides because it does kind of touch your back a little bit. And it's not quite sturdy enough to use as a real backrest. You can rest against it a little bit, but you can't put your weight on it or it'll just collapse again. Okay, now I'm on Morgan Territory Road, and the preserve is just up that way. I'll end up going through it, and then I'll come out the other side into Livermore. What is that? That's some interesting colors in that water. So, back to the subject of YouTube. I am very interested in what people would like to hear a person talk about on one of these videos. It's no secret that a video with somebody talking is going to get a lot more views than one of somebody just writing in silence. But as I mentioned, my main channel is a science and philosophy channel, and that's where I have most of my ideas of things I'd like to talk about. But that channel, I think, deserves a little bit more production to its videos. So I may use these opportunities when I'm just driving through some nice scenery to talk about some of the things that I would normally talk about on the other channel. And maybe I'll call them avocado thoughts, because they're usually thoughts that I've had while cutting into an avocado. Because, you know, it takes a little bit of time to cut up an avocado, and that's where I have some of my deepest thoughts. So I guess today's avocado thought, if you'll indulge me, is about vision and how it's not really vision. Or it's not seeing, I guess I should say. So, I think pretty much all of you will be familiar with the fact that when light enters your eye, it's turned into electrochemical energy that passes back through the optic nerve up into your brain. At that point, it's not light anymore. So, the light has been converted into a different signal, and then that signal gets processed by your brain, and it's not a one-to-one. And so when you see, what is actually happening is all inside of your brain. It's not in your eyes, right? There's no processing that happens inside your eyes. Your eyes are just passive receivers. So you're already a couple steps removed from the outside world. When you see something, what vision actually is not one-to-one with the outside world. And then if you pay very close attention to how vision works, in your own experience, you'll notice that things that you expect to see, you recognize immediately, right? The tree, hill, house. Those are all things that I have a reasonable expectation of seeing along this ride. But if a Sasquatch ran across the road in front of me, it would take me a little bit longer to realize what I'm looking at. It wouldn't be as instantaneous as everything else is around me. And you might think, well, yeah, it just takes a long time to recognize unexpected things. That's not a mysterious phenomenon. But I think what it reveals is that sight is actually an hallucination of the outside world. That you really only use your eyes to validate. Right now, as I look out in front of me, all of the things that I expect to see are indeed in front of me, and I recognize them essentially instantly because my brain is simulating the path ahead of me, and then my eyes take in visual information, and my brain does a comparison and says, yes, that is all what I expected to happen. Go on with your normal business. But if a Sasquatch ran in front of me, that's not something that I'm currently simulating to happen. And so when my brain checks against its passive visual information, it would find that there's a discrepancy, and it would take some time to update the simulation. And as it does that, that is the process that we call recognition. Maybe. What it can't be, what recognition cannot be, is a comparison of what you're seeing against all prior memories and images of something that you've seen in the past. It cannot be doing that because there's no way to guarantee that you've seen an object from every angle, or in every possible color, or in every possible state that some object can be in that might appear in front of you. And if it was actually checking against memory, it would almost never find the correct memory to match something up with. So something else has to happen. Something like a simulation of the object in 3 dimensions. And so you can imagine if you were building a brain that needed to see and needed to be able to recognize things in front of it, as long as you have... Whoa. Oh man, there's a lot of bugs here. Oh my gosh, this is unpleasant. I don't know if any of that was visible on the camera, but I just went through the mother of all swarms. I don't know what kind of bugs those were, but they hurt. So yeah, as long as you have this sufficient processing power, then the most efficient way to do that would be to spend formative years or formative weeks of the creature's life observing everything, creating a list of expectations, which in the Bayesian sense we would call priors, and then from there constructing simulations of the world around you given those priors, and then all the brain has to do is take in visual information and do a comparison. Does that visual information that's coming in match the expectation? And if it does, you just move on. If it doesn't, then you need more processing power. And that way you can get along doing other things. You don't have to devote so much to vision. A very large portion of our brain's energy and processing cycles goes toward vision already. So the less it has to do, the better. And you may have noticed in your own life that, you know, especially if you're driving, when you start to sort of think you start to sort of daydream or think about other things that are more interesting than your drive, your vision kind of dims, right? It becomes less an important part of your conscious thinking, whatever that is. And it's only when something unexpected happens that suddenly whoosh, your vision snaps into full clarity and high fidelity. And that's just an efficiency thing. You know, your brain doesn't need high fidelity vision when it has this pretty workable simulation going all the time. And all it has to do is compare. So, in a sense, vision is not that different from dreaming, where you construct a whole world around you and you're inside of it. It's just that when you're awake, there's a comparison that happens between the dream and the outside world in order to keep the dream what we might call veridical, you know, that has some kind of mapping to the real world that's useful. Now, there is a philosopher named Donald Hoffman. I forget what university is at. It might be Stanford. Oh, these bugs are insane. He has a hypothesis that, given all that I've said, that vision is a simulation anyway, that simulation is in no way veridical. In other words, it doesn't match the outside world at all. That it is just a useful interface for us to get along in a world that we really have no conscious access to. Now, I'm going to unpack that because that sounds very woo-woo. But I think there's actually an interesting concept in there. So, if you think about the way a computer works, especially when with Windows installed or Mac OS, for you crazy people who use that, when you look at the desktop and you have all your icons on there and you have an icon of a document and you can double click the icon and open that document, and maybe it's your senior thesis or something, what you perceive to be happening is that there is a document sitting on a desktop, and inside that document, if you can open it, are all the words that you've written. Now, I think I'm not going out on a limb here to say that we all know that's not reality. That the document doesn't exist on a desktop, because the desktop doesn't exist either. These are all notional things that are constructed by the operating system because it's a useful user interface for accessing data on a computer, which is just stored as ones and zeros on a magnetic drive somewhere. And none of us are fooled by that, oh wow, there's really a desktop inside my computer that has documents scattered all over it. We all know that's a fiction, but it's a useful fiction, and we can get a lot more done on a computer that way. And what Donald Hoffman is suggesting is that the same thing is happening with perception. Perceiving the outside world is a user interface that is useful for what we need to do, but goes no further than that. It is not a one-to-one mapping of the outside world, or even close to that. It's not, in fact, veridical. When I see a tree in front of me, there is no tree there, or there is no thing. If I could somehow perceive the reality of the world around me, I would notice that there were essentially just objects or IDs of objects around me, and my perceptual system is filling in what information it can about those objects. It's mapping to other objects that evolution has imbued me with a useful set of to help me get along in life. So what is useful about a tree in an evolutionary sense to a creature like me? Well, it provides shade through its leaves. It might grow fruit. It has a hard exterior of the bark. I could maybe make weapons out of the branches. These are all useful categories of information that are true about the tree, irrespective of what the tree looks like to me or how I perceive it to look. All of these features of the tree require different orientations of myself to the tree to get access to those features. So in order to use the shade of the tree, I need to orient myself in some way relative to the tree and the sun in order not to get UV damage on my skin from the tree. However that happens in the real world, which we cannot have access to, a useful way that evolution might imbue us with the sense of doing that, of orienting ourselves that way, is to imagine that the tree is very tall relative to us, and so we just have to get under it. In Donald Hoffman's formulation of what reality might be like, or what it certainly isn't like, there's no such thing as under in a real sense. You know, that the world isn't three-dimensional in the way that we understand it, and it's not some other dimensional either. It's not two-dimensional or one-dimensional. It's actually zero-dimensional, or at least there are no spatial dimensions to the world. I realize as I'm saying this is going to get more and more distant from the kinds of things that motovlog viewers want to listen to, but I'm going to keep talking anyway. So if the world doesn't have spatial dimensions, but we still perceive that it does, what does it have then? And he would say it has relational dimensions. And this is actually not that wild of an idea. It's not even a new idea. The Greeks used to think of the world this way, that space, and by space I mean the space between objects, not outer space, but that space wasn't a thing. That you couldn't say that there was space between me and the tree, because there's nothing between me and the tree, right? And giving it a name doesn't make it a thing. And so the Greeks would say, no, there is no thing between you and the tree. There is a relationship that you have to the tree, which is that you're distant from it. And if you think of distance as just sort of one of the possible states that you can have with respect to another thing, or one of the possible states that another thing can have with respect to your categorization of that object. And that state would necessarily have other useful things on it, like color, availability of food, whether it's wet, whether it poses a threat to me, things like that. So as I perceive the tree, I make all these assessments about it, and one of those is distance. And in order to be able to make assessments of distances to many objects all at once, I can orient them in some sort of three-dimensional space and give them relations to each other, so that I can get a sense of how difficult it might be to reach something. So, for instance, those mountains out there, I don't know if they're even visible on camera, it's kind of a hazy day, but those mountains are much more distant than these trees are. And so if there was something that I needed in those mountains, what is true about those mountains is that it's going to take me longer to put myself in closer relationship to those mountains than it would be to put myself in closer relationship to the trees. And it is possible that in doing either of those things, putting myself in closer relationship to one or the other, that I'm not actually moving through three-dimensional space. I'm just expending energy in order to, in a sense, close the gap or change that relationship. And a very useful interface for making all of that make sense to a being that, has limited perception of the real world, is to just create a three-dimensional world where things are far away and they're close and they have spatial relationships to each other. So Donald Hoffman calls this the interface theory of perception. And he says that he has some numerical models that prove that it must be true that if evolution, by means of natural selection, is a real thing, and we have every reason to think that it is, then evolution would never imbue a creature with a veridical perceptive system, or perceptual system. It would instead imbue it with this sort of interface that was only providing the information that was useful to higher reasoning, or even to the base instincts of satisfying your needs. And so it's a little bit like those Looney Tunes cartoons where one of the characters, like Elmer Fudd or something, is very hungry, and he sees another character, and rather than seeing that character for what he is, he just sees a slab of meat. So the interface theory of perception is sort of like that rather than seeing anything for what it is, we just see the things about it that are useful to us. And then we construct an interface in which we can make predictions about how difficult or easy some kind of task will be, if that task is, for instance, getting food. Now, I don't know what to think about that. I don't know if any of that is true. I have the sense that there is probably some truth in it, that our brain takes shortcuts when it builds a perceptual model of what's around us, and those shortcuts make it easier to process how we might complete tasks in the world. But I don't know if I definitely believe that interface is so far from reality such that there is no such thing as three dimensions. And one reason that I have some doubts, and it would be very interesting to hear his response to some of these questions, is when you look at something like a barrel eye fish, which has to eat food that is typically above itself. And for most creatures that have to do this in the ocean, when they eat food that is typically above them, evolution gives them certain kinds of anatomy that makes it easier for them to look up. Some of these fish, for instance, just put both eyes on the side of their body and turn their body sideways so they can just always look up. And then they can sit on the bottom of the ocean with both eyes looking up, and they're flat against the ground so they don't scare their prey away. Now that's one solution to the problem of having to look up. But barrel eye fish, they evolved a totally different solution, which is just to make the top of their head clear, and then to orient their eyes as they grow inside their body to be inside their head looking up at all times. And their eyes then look up through a clear head at everything above them, which is fascinating and gross at the same time. Because if you look up a picture of a barrel-eyed fish, and maybe I'll include one, you can actually see their brain inside their head, because their head is clear. Now, if the world wasn't three-dimensional, and all of this was just some fiction that our brain creates in order to make getting food more easy, then barrel-eyed fish would not need to evolve a clear head. They would just need to evolve a different interface, right? What it implies that they do have a clear head so that they can see through their head is that the spatial orientation of objects above themselves, and those objects can be obscured by their own head, has some reality to it. And that reality had to be defeated through evolution, which imbued them with a clear head. Similarly, if you look at how animals evolve the ability to see in 3 dimensions, they almost always, and there are some very interesting exceptions that I'll get to, but they almost always evolve eyes facing forward, set some distance apart, because then the two eyes will experience parallax with respect to one another. Parallax is the tendency of objects in the distance to move differently than objects in the foreground. So if I put my finger in front of me and I close one eye at a time and then close the other eye, my finger moves with respect to the objects in the background. That's called parallax. And when you have eyes that face forward, then your brain can use the parallax of objects in the foreground to construct a 3-dimensional image of what's in front of you. That's very useful if you, for instance, need to get prey. That, you know, if it's over by that tree over there, I can gauge the distance to that tree because I can sense the parallax of that tree with respect to the mountains behind it. Now, almost all creatures that need to see in 3 dimensions have evolved a very similar setup. If you think of lions, tigers, obviously, bears that need to catch a fish that's jumping out of a waterfall, humans, obviously, birds, which are not that closely related to us. Birds of prey all have their eyes facing forward. Now, one very interesting exception is something like a pigeon, which lives in environments where it needs to avoid obstacles. Now, presumably, before there were cities, doves and pigeons lived in forests or something like that. They needed to fly around things. But doves and pigeons are also prey animals, and so they need their eyes on the side of their head to be able to look behind them a little bit. So how do they get around this problem of needing really good 3-dimensional sight in order to navigate a complicated arrangement of objects in their flight path, but also needing the eyes on the side of their head in order to avoid being somebody's lunch? The way that they've done this is by moving their head. If you watch a pigeon walking along the ground, its head bobs back and forth. Now, part of that is because of the way their vestibular system works to keep their head parallel to the ground. If you hold a pigeon and move it around, you'll notice its head stays locked to the horizon. That's part of it. But the other part is that by moving their head like that, they get 2 glances at the world around them from different perspectives very quickly, just in the way that we do when we have 2 eyes looking at the same thing. And their brain can piece together the 3-dimensional orientation of all the objects around them. So again, I ask, if 3 dimensions was not a real thing, why would pigeons need a special solution for seeing 3 dimensions when they don't have binocular vision. Clearly, having 3-dimensional vision is evolutionarily useful, so much so that we have changed the whole shape of our head in order to accommodate it. And pigeons have in themselves a very strange head bobbing behavior in order to sort of fake it. And so for those reasons, I think we can conclude that 3-dimensional vision, whatever it is, has something like a veridical mapping to something that is true about the world around us. And I think, for the sake of parsimony, what might be true is that the world really is 3-dimensional. Otherwise, I think other creatures would simply evolve a different interface that gave them access to 3-dimensional information without having the requisite biology for it. And we don't see that anywhere in nature. Nothing appears to have 3-dimensional vision without 3-dimensional vision. So that's one of the big reasons why I have doubts about the interface theory. But I think there's possibly something real there to the theory. I mean, that our brain is constructing an interface of what is around us that makes it useful to us, rather than flooding us with a bunch of extraneous information about the real world that we don't need. And it could be that is why the aspects of reality that we don't commonly live in, like the world of the very, very small, on a quantum level, is so unfamiliar to us and so strange, because that may be where, well, in fact, it is almost certainly the case that on that scale is where aspects of the real world that are not useful to us make themselves most evident.